When people think about scope, they usually think about time and cost. Time and cost are the outputs of scope. They're figured out after the scope is defined. After all, you don't want to estimate how long it will take and how much it will cost to build a bridge before you know how big that bridge needs to be. In this lesson, we'll examine the process that defines how big or little the project will be, the defined scope process. The purpose of the defined scope process is to make a detailed description of the project and the deliverable. Sometimes, especially on a large project, the scope is bound to change as the details become clearer. As they become clearer, more complications usually creep in. The defined scope process takes the high-level view from the project charter and breaks it down to ground level, and it sets the tone for a lot of the project manager's planning effort. If this process is done poorly, it's unlikely that the rest of the project planning will be done very well either. The first input into the defined scope process is the scope management plan. This plan establishes the activities that the project manager will perform in order to develop, monitor, and control the project scope. The project charter provides the big picture of the project, which will be broken down into detailed descriptions during this process. Requirements documentation will be used to identify the requirements that have been gathered from the stakeholders that will be included in the project. Organizational process assets like policies, templates, project files, and lessons learned from previous phases or projects are useful in determining the scope of the new project. The first tool and technique a project manager will use during the defined scope process is expert judgment. It's always a good idea to use people who have the experience in analyzing business needs when defining a project scope. Product analysis is used for projects that have tangible products as a deliverable, things you can actually touch and use. Product analysis uses techniques like value analysis that can be helpful when translating the high-level product descriptions into actual deliverables. Alternatives generation helps to give the project manager options when choosing a scope management techniques that they will use while performing the work of the project. Facilitated workshops are working sessions that are useful to help the project manager and the stakeholders develop a common understanding of the project's limits and its overall objectives. The main output of the defined scope process is the project scope statement. This detailed description of the project scope includes a detailed description of the major deliverables, the project assumptions, and the constraints on the project. It also has a breakdown of the work required to deliver the product, service, or result. Remember, only that work which is absolutely necessary to complete the project is included in the project scope statement, not any gold-plated items that may come up later. If the scope is revised, project document updates to the stakeholder register and any requirements documentation are an output of this process. The defined scope process takes the high-level descriptions from the project charter and creates a detailed definition of the scope for the project scope statement. It's important to note that the project scope may not be fully defined during this first run through this process. As always, additional risks, assumptions, and constraints are usually added as the planning process progresses. The project scope can be revised or updated as necessary as part of the iterative process of developing the project scope, but remember, there's a big difference between revising the scope and changing the scope when completing a successful project.